second in the series of the 95 talks. This is Lizzie Hackney. She is the lead intergenerational missioner for Hereford Diocese, and she's going to be here talking to us today about doing mission in small and rural contexts. So over to Lizzie.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful for just to be here with you who've gathered here and also you online. Thank you so much for being interested in this important subject. And it's really exciting to be talking about mission. I'm passionate about rural contexts and small group contexts, so I was really pleased to be asked. But I'm going to start by just inviting you to be still and just centre ourselves. When we engage in mission with many of the churches in our diocese, in Hereford Diocese, we often use storytelling. Because I feel that our presence here on earth, our mission, all begins with a story. And it's about God. And it is God. God is the story. So I'd like just to start by reflecting on who God is. Because right at the very beginning of time, in the darkness, in the quietness, in the void, where there was an absence of anything, God spoke. And God spoke life and light and the very colours and just the energy of God spilt into all of the universe. And as God created a home for us, oceans swept over a ball of rock. And the grass grew, and the trees grew, and green appeared everywhere, and colours and flowers and birds, and the great leviathan swam, and the tiny little plankton. And the world was so full of life, so full of buzzing and swarming and swishing and swooshing, and there was life. And in that home, there was a garden. It was the place that God created for his people, his family. It was a place full of life. Our first commandment from God was to cultivate that land, to protect it, to look after it, to grow things, to multiply. God is a rural God. He is God of life and creation. And as the darkness fell, and as sin entered our created world, it got really hard to till the land. It was painful. There was suffering. There was so much suffering. And yet God was still present in the land, in the sea, in the air. God's presence was innately there. And even through the struggle, God was growing and God was looking after us. And as God's Son walked the earth, so many times as he told stories, just like I'm telling a story today, he reflected on the land that his Father had created. He looked across the ocean and talked about the waves and the fish. He looked across the hill, the sea of 5,000 people. And he looked and he saw a sower sowing seeds generously, ridiculously, to all places, not just the places where it would obviously grow, but the unobvious places too. That seed was sown with such generosity, such abundance. And Jesus commanded us to go and make disciples. And he commanded us to do it generously. To sow the seeds where there are plenty of people, those cities and those urban places, but also everywhere. Just sow the seeds where there is one or two, the lost sheep, where there are only a few. Still, the generosity of God is to be sown. That good news is to be placed. For we have a generous God. And I don't believe that the commandment to cultivate the land and to go and make disciples, I don't believe those two commandments are not connected. And that actually the home that God has given us, the land that we find ourselves in, the context that we find ourselves in, can often be something that is just as useful to God as the things that we learn on a Sunday morning, as the things that we learn as we're in our home group settings, that God speaks to us through the land in which we find ourselves. I had a few thoughts that I wanted to share with you. So again, as our last speaker a month ago said, I don't have all the answers. Today is just about hopefully inspiring you that you are doing something wonderful, something so amazing that God called you into, and it is worthwhile. That hopefully we have a few thoughts. I'm going to invite somebody else up later to come and talk about their context and ideas that they've found really help in their rural and small context. But just really to give you a few musings that might help you as you discern what God is saying to you and what you're doing where you are. So the first thing I really wanted to talk about was just out of this story that I've just told, the story that we all share of our Creator God, that rural mission is something that does work. So one of the questions that we had was, does it work? Well, it does work because we're here and because the story has been passed on. And actually, through the centuries, people have heard the story of God in rural context, in small communities. It's been passed on, one-to-one, conversation to conversation. So it does work. But it could be better. It could always be better. It could always be more intentional. So the first thing I wanted to draw us to is just this idea that even though at the moment in our political context, in the context of our society, a lot of energy and resources goes to urban areas. And that's right, and it's really important. But actually, God is just as at work in rural contexts. And as we become a more urban society, often the rural context is where we can reconnect with that God, the Creator God. We are created as creative people. And something I've noticed in my ministry in rural contexts is just the embedded nature of spirituality. So in a rural year, there are times when there is harvest. There are times when there seems to be a darkness and nothing is happening. There are times when there are festivals. And something I love about working in a rural context is often smaller communities join together for those times. So there are times when we all work together. There are times when we all celebrate together. And actually, in a way that I've not experienced in some of my urban work, spirituality and the church is more able at times to be that salt and light in the everyday, because there is this connection with the land, with the Creator, and with how that we live our lives in a very embedded context where Christianity is lived out rather than just what we do on a Sunday. The other thing that I wanted to think about was the second thing was around how often in our rural churches we can feel like we're out on a limb and we're on our own, and it can feel like the church is declining. And to be truthful, it is declining. We are declining in numbers on a Sunday, and that's scary and that's tragic, and we need to do something about it, and there's an urgency to that. What does happen though is we forget that actually our small context that we might see on a Sunday morning, when added up across our nation, adds up to a lot. So in Hereford Diocese, we have 405 parish churches. We are the most rural diocese in the country. We have so many buildings compared to how many people we have. And although there might only be 12 people gathering on a Sunday morning, when you add that up, that is more than our biggest congregation. So the rural presence, people gathering together, is actually quite phenomenal, but we don't see it. We don't see the huge numbers, we only see our tiny context. So actually, what you do and how you interact with those people, how you minister to those who gather in those small contexts has a phenomenal just amount of influence over a huge number of people. But it's really hard to keep going when you only see those few and think, oh, we are dwindling. But remember that it's bigger than just that small group. Messy Church is really big across our diocese, and it's our biggest growth point, an intergenerational church, and also something called Explore Together, which I think Scripture Union had something to do with. We find that those things that are growing have an intergenerational flavour, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the thing we also notice is that something that's so huge, like Messy Church and huge congregations, are often times where, although it's really fun and it's really great, sometimes you get to the end of a messy church and you think, what just happened? What was the point of that? It was great, but what was it all about? Some of our most profound moments have been in the times when not many turned up. When maybe we only had a couple of families. When maybe we were doing a craft and not many children wanted to do it, but maybe 3 children did it for the whole time. And suddenly the conversations that we had were deeper, were more meaningful. We had a chance to really get to know people. And so actually my suggestion would be, is if you find yourself in a small context where there's only a few people at any one time, treat it as a strength. Because discipleship is all about the one-to-one. It's all about the relationship. Showing someone Jesus is really all about showing Jesus in you. So if somebody gets to know you, they get to know Jesus. And actually, what we're seeing as immediately a negative in that we don't have many people around can be our biggest strength as a church in a rural context, that we can have those connections and those relationships. We find that in the communities where we work, obviously, a lot of families need to travel to get to go shopping, to get what they need. And something we've noticed in terms of the children and young people that we work with is that small group context actually is really healthy and positive for them to get to know one another. But the thing that really helps them to grow is to step outside that context, to experience something a little bit bigger in a market town or a city, or just in a the next parish, or in another denomination, to get together with more people, to recognise that we're a little bit bigger than we thought, that the church is bigger than we thought, that there are children and young people out there. Last 2 Sundays ago, I think it was, we had our Pentecost celebration at the cathedral, where we had over 300 people gather, and many of those from very tiny congregations who would not normally experience being together with over 300 people. But those times give you just such an inspiration that God is at work, that the church is much bigger than you think it is, and that you're part of something, the move of the Holy Spirit as he gathers more into his church. So something we found definitely in working with children and families and young people is to keep plugging away at trying to take them to something outside of the context. And then when they come back, it gives them more of a sense of belonging and identity where they are, but also a sense of belonging and identity to something bigger. So actually, I would like to suggest that small contexts are something to celebrate and to use and to be intentional about, rather than worrying that this is a dearth of spirituality. It can be really, really exciting. In church, we often talk about how we are like a family. In fact, church is a family. God adopts us into his family. We are family. So often in more urban contexts, there is a lot of kind of generating this sense of belonging to one another, of being all ages together, of journeying as a family. I found in rural context this already exists. They might not necessarily feel that they are part of God's family, but the communities we serve definitely see themselves as a community. Quite often there are strong family connections and a strong sense of belonging and of different generations gathering together. So it's a bit like the church already has people around and belonging to these churches that know how to do community. They don't need to know any more about that. It's more about the intentionality that they need to understand a little bit more. As you become a Christian, as you journey with God, just being aware of God at move in your community. Something that we've really recognised in Hereford Diocese over the last year and a half, 2 years, we've been doing something called Follow, where we've been talking in different congregations, pubs, schools, community contexts. What is God doing? Where is he at work? And what are you seeing? And across the board, as I've already said, we found messy church was really important, but also just times when people gathered. So pop-up cafes, mothers and toddlers groups at the same time as coffee mornings. There was a theme around intergenerational stuff. So the idea that people were gathering as all ages, that it wasn't looking how we expected it to look. We have very few children's and youth groups in our diocese, considering we've got so many churches and such a large landmass. But we have a lot of examples where different generations gather together. On the one hand, we feel that that's something that families look for today, and that's a great opportunity. And it's also something that is a reaction to our lack of resources. So in a rural context, there is significantly less paid workers, people who are trained as youth workers. Curates and vicars, they're not necessarily trained in rural ministry, and youth workers definitely are not normally trained in a lot of rural ministry. So most of this ministry that's happening is definitely with lay people, with volunteers, with people who are unpaid, and often we reflect what resources we have. So although we might not be able to do a children's and youth group, we carry on through that kind of year of festivals and times of fetes and fairs. We gather for things like Messy Church. We gather to celebrate. We have meals together. And church looks intergenerational. That's another thing to celebrate, because if we are a family of God, then that is what it's about. The other thing that is a great opportunity with rural ministry is we find that most of our parish churches have links with a school, whether that's the Church of England school or not, and normally have very positive relationships with those. So although our children and young people are not attending church on a Sunday, almost all of them will be experiencing spirituality and Christianity in a school context. In fact, most of the children and young people that I work with would feel that they are doing church when they have collective worship, especially if there's someone there who's attached to a church, so a vicar or a volunteer who's going in and saying, I come from St Margaret's, and they feel that they are doing church in that context. I sense that there's a really strong prayer life within schools, and in fact we encourage people to have prayer spaces and prayer trees, and often I will find after I've gone in to do an assembly or a collective worship that children are around the prayer tree already wanting to have a go at that prayer, and not chatting to each other but just holding a teaspoon to pray the teaspoon prayer, or putting a fruit on the tree. So it's being aware that although we don't see them in church on a Sunday necessarily, there is so much of God's kingdom entering our schools. And that's wonderful, and that's to be celebrated. But it could be so much better. What if we actually took advantage of that, realised that God is out there in our communities and in our schools, and that we have a part to play? And church looks like our school building sometimes. So what could that look like? Something that often comes back to me in terms of schools is when a church says, well, we don't have a school in our parish anymore. And I would say that you still have children and young people in your parish. You might only have 2 or 3 in your village, but they go somewhere. And those are the children and young people that you can connect with. And we're encouraging churches to draw on volunteers from other parishes, the feeder parishes, so that we do this together, because it's quite a big job to have a ministry in a school. But if you draw those parishes together who have those connections with children and families in their parishes, then it can be possible and it can be exciting. We have also found through our follow conversations, this is a surprising one, particularly for me as a youth worker who've always said it's not about the building, how important the building is to children and young people and families. And the thing that the Church of England and many of our other denominations in rural contexts has is lots of ancient buildings in rural places. Now, that has its own problems, and it is difficult to sustain all of those. But if they're there and we have to keep them, I would like to say that they're also one of our biggest opportunities. So across the board, when we were discussing in the follow conversations and asking, where did you experience God? What is God doing? So many children, young people, families, young adults, and non-Christians in particular said, I feel God when I'm in a church building. It's a holy space. It's a sacred space. I feel like I can pray there. I feel like it's a sanctuary for me. And that's something quite amazing, that someone who wouldn't necessarily call themselves a Christian or go to church would have such a sense of God. So they're not saying this is a beautiful building. They're saying in this perhaps beautiful building, I sense God. There is something of awe within it. So something that we're encouraging people to think about is this idea of pilgrimage. Now, pilgrimage and journey has been a part of the Christian tradition for 2,000 years. It has been this journeying with Jesus, that Emmaus road, but also that sense of going from one place to another, together or alone, but definitely with God. And we find it a leveller to begin to think of ourselves as pilgrims, because even if somebody hasn't decided to journey with Jesus specifically, I think we're all pilgrims looking for something. We're all trying to seek out who we are and where we're going and what the world is about. And particularly in our messy churches, we've been encouraging them to think, how would your messy church change if you thought of those who attend as pilgrims and you thought of yourselves as welcomers of pilgrims? Because on the one hand, it's a leveller. And so kings and paupers would all go on pilgrimage together. You're just all journeying. On the other hand, there's this ministry of hospitality to pilgrims. And we're finding more and more today that people are looking for these ancient spaces, these outside spaces, as well as our buildings, these sacred spaces to journey to, particularly families together. So the National Trust is growing, and lots of people tick the box when they do their questionnaires saying, I'm looking for a space where I have a sense of awe. And that is growing. And just the opportunity that we have to use our buildings as welcoming places, as places that challenge people and ask questions and connect, but also importantly that people who come into our buildings feel that they are theirs to come to, that it's not a special club, that you don't have to have been confirmed and baptised and signed up and have a collar, that actually this is your building too. So if we're going to have these buildings, how are we going to use them? And how can they be part of supporting people in their journey? I wanted to invite someone to come and speak to you now from their context. This is Mark, and he's come from Tenbury. You can introduce your role and everything, but he's going to give you some ideas from his context.
So, okay, thanks Lizzie, thanks for all that. My context is I'm a pioneer minister in the Tenbury Team Ministry, which is quite trendy in the church at the moment. It's taken me to get to the age of 50 to do something trendy in the church, and I'm really pleased about it. Just to start with a bit of theology, Jesus said, as my Father has sent me, so I sent you. And in case you're confused by that, it means you and it means me. So let's stop the theology. I've been given a challenge, 10 ideas in 10 minutes. And Again, stop confusion. I'm not asking you to do 10 things. I'm asking you to do one in your local context. God's got a plan for all of us. And I think it might be really, really, really small. So start small. Do a small thing. Number 1, pray. If you haven't tried it, give it a go. I recommend it. It's radical. You don't even have to get out of your chair to pray. If you feel you're too old for mission, why don't you pray for it? Try it. Pray until something happens in your community. And then pray some more. Number 2, tea and toast. If your church is on a school run or has a school in the village, why don't you offer tea and toast to the parents on their way to school or on the way back? Did you know that over 4 million children in the UK live in poverty? Some of them will live in your community, I promise you. When you pray, give us today our daily bread, why don't you answer that in your community? Loaf of bread, a kettle, a toaster? If you can't open to the children and the young people and the parents, why don't you open to the elderly and offer them the same later in the day? Tea, cake, company. There's a lot of lonely people in rural areas because the buses don't run anymore. So if you can, do that. How difficult is it to bake a cake and to boil a kettle? Anybody can do that, even me. Number 3, church fates. I love church fates. I'm sure you do. Every church in my area has a church fete. How about this? Next to the tombola and the cake stall and the welly wanging, which I did last week. If you haven't tried that, any urban people, give it a go. You need a big space, but it's good fun. Instead, next to those places, put another tent and call it a prayer shed or a prayer shack. Offer people simply the opportunity to have people like you pray for them what they really need in their lives. Your heart will be broken by the stories that people will tell you, I promise you. All you have to do is pray for them, not solve the problem. And then stand back and see what happens and let God do his work in those people that you've prayed for. Number 4, do you see local businesses in your church? Rural businesses, lots of them, farmers, local shops, the garage. Have you noticed how many vans are parked outside your village houses? When I look around mine, I see plumbers and gas engineers and all sorts of people. Why don't you contact them? Why don't you knock on their doors or send them a letter and say, why don't you send me your prayer requests for your busy life, your busy family, your stressed business? People are working 14, 16, 18 hours a day to make ends meet. Why don't you try prayer for them and their families? And then stand back and let the Holy Spirit do his work and see what happens next. Number 5, are you worried that there's no young people, families in your church? What is it about your BCP at 8 o'clock in the cold that isn't attracting people? I can't imagine what that might be. I don't know about you. Why don't do this instead? On a nice summer's day, open up one of your nice gardens, fire up the barbecue, fill up the paddling pool, put the beers in the fridge and the cake, and then invite them all round for food and drink and fellowship. Break bread, drink wine, then see what happens then. Number 6, perhaps then. Running a messy church is really too hard for you. There's not enough resources. Don't try. Just try it once. Have a messy Advent. Make a Christmas card. How difficult it is to make a Christmas card? Almost anybody can do it. Invite all the children in your village to make a Christmas card for their mothers and fathers and grandparents. Sing a couple of songs, offer them a mince pie, then see what happens next. Just try it once. One messy Advent. Number 7, songs of praise. A lot of people like hymns. You could have a competition in your local village. Name your favourite hymn. You know what they are. And then, after you've done that, sing them one night. Get your best organist you can find. Sing all the best hymns and don't forget to miss out the sermon. And be generous. Be generous with refreshments afterwards. Just once. And if that works, see if they'll come back on a back to church Sunday. Invite every single person in the village to come once a year, sing the great hymns again, and again, be generous with the refreshments. Don't hold back. No tea biscuits, no digestives. At least get a chocolate hobnob. At least. Chill the white wine and warm the red wine, not the other way around. Please. What's happened in your village this year? Lots of weddings. I hope so. I'm doing 8 weddings this summer. Lots of baptisms, fantastic. But also lots of death and illness, probably true. If it is the latter, hold something for lament and grief and of healings. The world tells us we should move on, man up. But there's some grief that we take to the grave. Let's acknowledge that as the church. We are good at grief. We're good at dealing with bereavement. So let's celebrate that in a way that's sensible for your local community. Instead of a communion service, grieve, lament, cry. You don't need permission for a lot of these things. You don't need your PCC, your vicar, your minister, your pastor, your elders to do this. Though it's lovely if they agree. But if they don't, start your own revolution and cut out the middleman. So do things. Start a book club in your house. Start a film club. Hire a minibus for a day trip. Have a prayer walk around your community. Give a lift to the hospital for someone with no transport. Give some of your clothes away to someone who doesn't have any. Feed people. Hold a prayer vigil. Visit the lonely and sick when no one's asked you to do it. If you've been counting, that's more than 10. However, I've saved the best thing to the last. Number 10. It's the last thing is the biggest thing. Do you know it's the thing that will make a difference, dear listener? It's the thing that will transform your village, will transform our nation. It will transform your church. It will transform you as we let your kingdom come. It's this. Do the thing you already know has to be done. Do the thing that God has already asked you to do and you've not yet done. Do the thing that someone else in your village has asked the church to do and you haven't bothered. If you do that, things, I promise you, will change. Because God is speaking to us now. Can you hear the small, still voice? Perhaps we should do what he said and let his kingdom come. Thank you. Back to you, Lizzie.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I knew it would be well worth Mark sharing with us his reflections from his context. And I think I just wanted to reiterate really that the thing that what you've highlighted is that it needs to look like what God has called you to. And so often in the rural context, we can feel that we are not doing children's or youth work well because we look to an urban image of huge youth groups, huge children's groups, huge messy churches, big Sunday congregations, and therefore we are failing in what we are doing in the mission of God. But actually God calls us to our context in our way, that he has called us to a very specific thing. So definitely take on board those 10, well, more than 10 ideas that Mark has given, and think of your own, because actually it is about the small things. So just to reflect on some of the things that have come out of my musings, of what Mark has been talking about, and hopefully what you've been thinking really, that within those 4 areas that we mentioned, this connectedness to our Creator, so the land that we inhabit is created for us, that we are part of that creation, it has something to say to us. This idea of being small groups and actually that being a positive rather than a negative, a huge, great potential. That we live in community anyway, that actually we're just going to be more intentional and spiritual within that, but realise that rural churches have strong community connections. And also this idea of pilgrimage. And as we come up to summer, huge numbers of people from urban areas will be flocking out into our churches, whether to the coast or the countryside. They will be looking for places to inhabit and to find space. And isn't that actually what a holiday is? A holy day, a pilgrimage, that's where it came from, this idea of seeking space that just makes you more who you are in the everyday. So actually we have a huge mission field as a rural church, not only to our often small Sunday congregations, that's fine, but to all the people that come through our church building, that we connect with through the week, and to all of these people who flock to our spaces when they are on holiday. We have a huge mission. So I think some of the themes that came out for me was this idea of being intentional. So rather than just doing things because we've always done it, and that's always when the fete is, and that's always when we do what we do at Christmas, but actually thinking intentionally, what is God, what is that still small voice saying to us at this moment? That it's about relationships, and there's no apologies for that. That mission is relational, build on our strengths. I think there's something about confidence. So recent research has shown that actually our communities, and we found the same in our follow conversations, our communities really like us in general. They think we're nice people. They think we're quite kind and generous and caring, and they like that we're there, and they like that we're there for funerals and weddings and baptisms. And often as Christians we can think, oh, they probably don't want us to involve ourselves in their lives, and we need to mind our own business and get on with it. But actually, people are crying out for more of that caring generosity and more of that good news in our communities. So I think that the message that comes across through that recent research is confidence in so many reports that are coming out at the moment. Also prayer, as Mark mentioned. Prayer is the real key changer to everything. So being prayerful and listening for what God is saying to us. And you might have had some other ideas. So we're going to have a time now where you can chat amongst yourselves, where you can reflect on this at home or where you are. And just if you'd like to comment, ask a question, post it on Facebook for us if you'd like to ask that question, or if you're in the room here, you might want to come up with some comments and questions and reflections. I've put together some ideas to get you started, but you really don't have to answer these. These might not be the important questions for you at all. But here are just four questions you might want to think about. So the first one is all to do with this idea of the Creator God. So in what ways are our communities already connected to our Creator, and how can we nurture that in our mission and ministry? Something about the small groups. How can small groups be part of the mission of God? And how is that going to happen in your context? Something around being salt and light. So I particularly chose those images because often, as I said, our church is out there. They are visiting their neighbours. They're in the schools. They're doing all of these wonderful community things. But how can we be intentionally Christian and salt and light in those relationships, and particularly with children and young people? And lastly, something around pilgrims. How can we welcome pilgrims? How can we journey with people? So those are the four questions I had, but you might have your own. So over to you. 3 minutes, and then we'll come back together.
generation from granddads right down to little tots in the wellies who are really making a mess. But that, the contrast between one, going from one thing to another is really a flying start. That makes sense. You can see what people want to do, where they want to be. And there's a cool play that's still here. Some of our churches, you go outside the church and look around and you can't see the house. It's just a field. The village is gone. Look around, you can't see it.
So if you want to draw your conversations to a close, and this is just an open time really for any comments or questions. I don't know, I probably should invite Mark up as well in case people have got, if you've got the answer, because you probably will have rather than me. But yes, are there any comments, questions, things that people have been musing about?
What is your title?
Oh, I'll give you the microphone. Yeah.
My official title's Team Vicar, but that's not what I do. Yeah, officially I'm a pioneer minister, which means that I don't have responsibility for parish councils, parish PCCs, which is great. I don't have responsibility for Sunday worship, which is even better. So I'm doing some of the traditional stuff, but 80% of my time is working with the 95% who are not in the church. My colleagues look after the 5% who are. Does that make sense? My job is much more fun, I think. But you get to spend a lot of time in pubs and a lot of time in coffee shops and a lot of time meeting people where they actually live or where they socialise or where they work. And it's much more enjoyable than in being a vicar. So I am a proper vicar really, but these days I don't practice very much.
I just wanted to say that that's a really exciting thing really about Mark's post, is that the clergy, before Mark arrived, decided that they were going to give over a stipend to this type of post, that they recognised that was important. So that's quite a big thing, but really quite key, I think, as we move forward as a church, recognising that we need these exciting posts to reach these 95, and that's across the board, not just in rural areas really. Yeah. Yes, yeah, we could all do with Mark, yeah. Although you are all Marks in your situations, because we are all out there being, ministering to those 95. Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Do we have any from the Facebook?
We do. We do have some questions from Facebook. A couple of comments for you. First of all, rich tea biscuits. Apparently nothing wrong with rich tea biscuits. Comments about we have a few non-Christians in our village who are great at crafts, and so we supplement the few volunteers in our very tiny congregation by involving people in the wider community who have particular gifts, and they're usually very glad to help. So that's encouraging and another idea to share. But from that same context, later says, my village church has a congregation of just 7 people and a vicar that covers 5 other parishes. I seem to be the only one of the congregation interested in outreach, but always find myself pressurised by the other congregation members to sit on the PCC, be church warden, etc. Admin is not my gift or passion, but on the other hand, someone has to do it. I wanted to do outreach. That's really what I felt God called me to, this community to do. But if I'm the only one, it's really hard to do alone. Any advice on how on earth I might proceed?
Shall I answer first? Okay. I would say your situation is similar to many others, and actually the idea of you being the only one in that situation is probably why God has called you there, and you're the beginning, and you need to know that you're in the right place for this time. However, I would say that you're not called to do it alone, ultimately. And if I was local to you, I would be encouraging you to contact me or somebody else to stand with you and to be part of that conversation. Because if God has placed you there, he will have placed around you people to support you in that mission. So I think it's look outside your parish context, neighbouring parishes, or if you're in a Church of England church, it would be diocesan people who are out there who want to support you in doing outreach. That's what we're about. If you're not in an Anglican context, I don't know the right words, but there will be people out there who want to support you in it. And start with that, and just start by praying with them. And things do happen when you pray. Do you want to add anything to that, Mark?
Just a little thing. We love our church wardens and our treasurers and our PCC secretaries, and we love them and we're glad they're there. But the church will continue whether they're there or not. The church will not continue if we don't share the good news of Jesus. So if they've been called to be church warden, thank God for them. If you've been called to evangelism, thank God for you. Do what God has asked you, not what he hasn't. It really is that simple. Thank you.
We've got one other question here. What would Lizzie suggest for those 2 or 3 children already in the church community so they could be part of the mission? So mission is done with them, by them, not only to them.
I was, at one point in my life, I was one of the 2 or 3 in the church, or the only one at times. And the thing that made the biggest difference for me, and I think the reason that for me why I'm in church in the first place, was that people were interested in me and valued me. And although I was a young person in the church, or a child in the church as I was growing up, my opinion was always valued, and the contribution that I played to the mission of the church was always valued. So to start with, I think it's in the attitude that you have, that these 2 or 3 are equally called, as you all are, to this context and this time. So including them in big things like decision making, and not just giving the hymn books out on a Sunday, even though that's nice too, but just recognising, I think, this intergenerational church idea that we're all called, whatever our age. And I think as well, as I've said earlier, that coming outside of your context sometimes is really, really important, because you don't know what God has called these 2 or 3 to in the rest of their lives. And so it could be the most important thing that you ever do is nurture their faith and support them in their faith. And so I think making an effort to take them to things that might help them, but recognizing that they're called to your context and that they have a part to play, I think.
Great. Well, we've come to the end of our time together today. I just want to say thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
For helping us to just think through some of those trickier issues around doing mission in small and rural contexts. Please do share the video on Facebook, watch again if you'd like to. If you're sitting here and you think you missed something, then do sign up to our 95 community online, and you can watch this talk again if you'd like to. So thanks for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.